Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion jointly hosted between Talking Foreign Affairs and the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. I'm Adil Cader, founder of Talking Foreign Affairs, and I'll be your moderator today. Tonight, we'll be discussing New Zealand's role in navigating Trump 2.0 and a rising China. As America becomes more assertive in its foreign policy, China is also increasingly seeking to expand its influence. This leaves New Zealand with the challenge of maintaining balance in an evolving geopolitical landscape. Here to discuss that with us are two distinguished panelists. First, we are honored to have Sir John Key, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Sir John Key was Prime Minister of New Zealand from 2008 to 2016. While in office, he led key foreign policy moves. This included reaffirming New Zealand's nuclear-free stance and signing the 2010 Wellington Declaration to boost U.S. New Zealand defense ties. Since leaving office, he has served on various boards and is a regular media commentator on U.S. politics. Second, we have Professor Bill Hurst, co-director at the Center for Geopolitics, and Chong, Professor of Chinese Development. Professor Hurst is considered one of the world's leading academics on Chinese politics and East Asia. He has authored several books and publications on this topic. He's also very active on Twitter with insightful analysis, and his handle is at WJHurst. Just a brief note on this panel format. This panel will run for around an hour. This will feature 30 minutes of moderated discussion, followed by audience questions. Thanks to everyone who submitted in questions. And just a bit of an interesting note, this is the first collaboration between TFA and Cambridge University Center for Geopolitics. Those of you who have visited the Cambridge University campus would know that the Center for Geopolitics is actually located on a street called Trumpington Street. So if there ever was a more appropriate topic, I think this one would be it. But without further ado, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to start off looking at U.S.-New Zealand relations and under Trump 2.0. And so, John, I'd like to start with you. Just before the U.S. election, in a media interview, you stated that Donald Trump wouldn't necessarily be the best choice for New Zealand. We're now a few weeks into his presidency. What's your analysis so far?
Well, look, the basis of those comments, I mean, I predicted him to win, thought he would win, and was not surprised he won. And I'm actually not opposed to Donald Trump at all. In fact, many of his right-wing policies I would support. But I think what's pretty clear is that Donald Trump's tapped into a very strong movement in the United States. It's really all about America first. And it takes America's perspective and position and says, we're no longer going to be the global enforcer, the global policeman, the globalists that we were post-World War II. And so I think in that regard, if you think about New Zealand, a little country at the bottom of the world, not particularly vulnerable in a sense that probably not that many people actually want to come and do harm to us. But nevertheless, we have relied on global sort of syndication of our defence, if you like. Now, I'm not saying that the Americans wouldn't come and defend us if required, but what I think is, as a general rule, the perspective that Donald Trump will take pretty much when it comes to everything will be looking through a lens of what's good for America, and everyone else will have to a certain degree, fend for themselves.
And just touching a bit upon that, I know New Zealand's foreign policy is deeply tied to the rules-based international order, whereas Trump has promoted more of a unilateral brand, moving away from rules-based order more towards power. How do you think New Zealand should cope with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge has been we've always had what's called an independent, well, for a very long time, independent foreign policy. And so we make our own decisions, our own assessment of any particular situation. For the most part, we have been supporters of our traditional allies when required. I sent the SAS to Afghanistan and to Iraq. But Helen Clark, for instance, chose not to send people initially into the Gulf War or the Iraq War. I think what's going to make a bit more of a challenge is that I think with President Trump, you can see it's pretty much an attitude with us or against us. So our number one trading partner is pretty much China. So we've always had good relations with China. I mean, I, for instance, had 7 state visits to China when I was Prime Minister. Xi Jinping came twice to New Zealand. So the problem will be that if the world starts shaking down, if you like, to a perspective of whether you are either with us or against us, you're choosing one or the other, that puts New Zealand in a very difficult position, because from a traditional ally perspective, it's clearly going to choose, the United States and the UK, Canada and Australia. And that's why there's a lot of discussion in the media here about whether the government would consider a move to AUKUS 2, Pillar 2. On the other side of the coin, doing that will, without doubt, I think, have damage to both our relationship with China and potentially our trading opportunities with China.
Certainly, I mean, AUKUS was the next thing I was coming to. I know that Foreign Minister Winston Peters has talked initially about getting public support initially for AUKUS Pillar 2 before any serious policy move on that. But just on that note, Professor Bill, what are your thoughts on New Zealand joining AUKUS, and do you think it could anger China?
Well, it's not even so much a question of what China feels about some of this as a sort of broader, more structural issue, which is that how reliable is the United States looking ahead? And so I think, I mean, you in your intro characterized Trump as being more assertive in American foreign policy than his recent predecessors. I'm not so sure. I actually think the U.S. is pulling back from the world. There are gaps opening up that the U.S. used to fill, and I think in that light, the question is: can a country like New Zealand continue to rely upon the United States as much as it has really done since at least World War II, if not longer, and on this general arrangement of collective security in different frameworks, treaty frameworks, as well as Five Eyes, more informal framework, and so on. And so, to the extent that the U.S. is a less reliable partner, I think it actually opens up an interesting additional angle. But before we even get to that, I think there is this other question of how to manage a state of affairs in which China's not going anywhere, New Zealand's not going anywhere, other countries throughout the Pacific aren't going anywhere. China's always going to be an important economic relationship. It's just not feasible to ask any of those countries to walk away from the economic ties that bind them to China. But at the same time, a country like New Zealand, or for example, most states in Southeast Asia or throughout the Pacific, are just not comfortable relying upon China in security terms, or having even a closer relationship with China in security terms. And so the question is how to balance the relationship with the US and others on the security side with the relationship with China on the economic side. And then not only how to do that, but for, say, the US in this arrangement, how can the United States increase its security leverage in the region, assuming it wants to, and bind Australia, New Zealand, other countries throughout the region, like, say, Singapore, Malaysia, etc., Philippines, closer to the US on the security side, while also not preventing them from continuing their trade relations with China. There's really a difficult set of things to be worked out there. If we think about, what would AUKUS do in terms of China? Of course, China's not happy with AUKUS in general, or with an expansion of AUKUS to include New Zealand. Would it make or break China's trade initiatives to New Zealand? Probably not, actually. I don't think it would have a very large effect there at all, assuming that a larger framework comes into the picture in which the US and to some extent, I guess, the UK and Australia in this picture as well would accept the idea that New Zealand would continue to have a flourishing trade relationship with China, despite the security tie being strengthened with the West. And so I don't think it would be a deal breaker either way, actually, but it would require some careful navigation. I apologize also for the fact that I'm stricken with this terrible cold and therefore sounding quite under the weather.
That's perfectly fine. You raised some good points in regards to the impact that would have on China, and we'll get a bit more into China specifically a bit later on, but still sticking on AUKUS. So John, I know Foreign Minister Winston Peters spoke initially before joining AUKUS Pillar 2 that he wanted more domestic support in regards to from New Zealand. This was this was under the Biden administration. Does a new president in the White House make that more challenging, or do you think it's still the same challenge selling AUKUS 2.0, sorry, AUKUS Pillar 2 to the New Zealand public?
Well, I think there's no question that Donald Trump's not a terribly popular figure in New Zealand. I think if you look at the period of time when I was in office, it was largely dominated by Barack Obama. And Obama, if you just had taken a poll of the New Zealand public, was massively popular. I think there'd be a lot of people that just in New Zealand couldn't understand Donald Trump, would find it very combative, would be concerned about potential tariffs and other issues. So I don't think he'd be nearly as popular figure. So if it was trying to say, well, come to AUKUS Pillar 2 on the basis of we like Donald Trump, then I think you're going to struggle. But what I would say, it's interesting that Winston Peters, the defense minister, it's less certain about the prime minister, are all forward-leaning when it comes to Donald Trump and the United States and the deepening of that relationship. They're more traditionalists. They look at our previous ANZUS relationship, and they see AUKUS Pillar 2 as a way of recreating that now that ANZUS is suspended. So I think that politicians are always great for saying that they'll seek out a public opinion, but in the absence of a referendum, and you'd never have a referendum on this issue, then I think they would over time say, look, we will do what we believe to be in the best interest. I mean, you may have seen last week that China was very active with the Cook Islands. We'll get back to the boats that are, been causing issues in the Tasman Sea or off the coast of Australia and New Zealand, but they just give visual indicators to the New Zealand public that, gosh, China's getting more active. Are they playing nicely with us? I mean, these warships discharged live ammunition with little or no warning to commercial aircraft firing. It's quite in a way, a reasonably aggressive things to do. And the more that the public in New Zealand see that, the more they would say, well, I don't know how friendly they are. So I think Professor Bill's right. I think the public would struggle to see the Chinese as reliable as a defense partner, whereas they'd see the Americans as utterly reliable. But on the other side of the coin, it's just a very difficult situation. But these kinds of things are pushing people more in a public sentiment sense, at least, to say, well, okay, maybe we do need to be a bit closer to the Americans, if it's a choice.
Yes, and we mentioned about ANZUS and then the suspension. That's something I'm very keen to get to. And we've just spoken about the public perception. I'm trying to get this from a policymaker perspective. I know you can in the mid-80s what happened with New Zealand being suspended from ANZUS, and then with when you helped to negotiate the 2010 Wellington Declaration, which was kind of a makeup of the fallout from the mid-80s. I interviewed Sir Don McKinnon on my program, former foreign minister, and he said at the time that it wasn't there wasn't consensus. There were some people in the opposition at the time who felt that was the wrong move. But you could argue it took 25 years to mend or 35 years to mend the relationship, given that it took up until 2010 with the Wellington Declaration to mend those relations. How much of that is in the psyche of policymakers, in the sense of it took so long to mend the relationship after what happened in the mid-80s, that are New Zealand policymakers more cautious now to avoid some fallout like that again?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go all the way back to what sort of drove the problems, it was really New Zealand's anti-nuclear stance and the fear the Americans had that it would have a contagion effect. And I mean, I don't think they were really that worried about, the fact that we didn't particularly want nuclear ships, or other than on a confirm or deny basis. And the way that they believed that politicians of the day and the Longy government had utterly misled them. So there was quite a big breakdown in trust. And it took a very long time. And I think we were more on a more negative list, if you like, than would make logical sense. I mean, I remember having discussions with some very senior leaders in Washington, and they said at every level, New Zealand is considered like family and an incredibly close friend, including being part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing relations. But we're still on some list sitting out there, which kind of includes North Korea and Iran and us. I mean, it really didn't sort of make any sense. It was completely over the top. So it did take a long time, and my government did negotiate the USS Sampson, the first US warship, to come to New Zealand. The latter time of me being Prime Minister. And, I mean, a lot of people don't understand what the law says is the Prime Minister has to satisfy him or herself that the ships are neither nuclear powered or carrying nuclear weapons. As long as you do that, you're fine. The Americans don't have to say to us, by the way, this is the case, you just need to satisfy yourself. Obviously, we were utterly sure that the Sampson was incapable of doing either of those things, and so we signed off. It's a symbolic gesture, but there has been I think if you went to State Department and particularly the Pentagon, then I think there were some very deeply broken relations around the way New Zealand and America conducted, the breakup. So on both sides, it took a very long time. But as I say, if we go back to the basis of the whole thing, there is just no question that if you went to the average New Zealander, if that's the test, in the street and said, tell me your friends, in an international sense, they'd say the like-minded Western democracies, Canada, Australia, the UK, and the United States. And in a gunfight, who could we rely on? It would be that. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, and we can get to trade later, I think it'd be interesting to see what the Chinese reaction would be, because smaller countries are more vulnerable. If you look in with the China-Australian relations, when things were really going bad and the beef and barley ban was on, it was really interesting. I mean, the Chinese were able to pick very carefully. They wanted to continue to have iron ore, so they bought that because it was important for them. But they stopped the things that kind of hurt Australia and for which there wasn't nearly as good an alternative market. So I'm not suggesting for one moment that the doors would close to everything. But I think if we were at a point where they no longer saw New Zealand as what's been quite a good friend over the last 20 years, I'm not entirely convinced that every single line item would flow over the border. They might buy Zesperi's kiwi fruit because the alternatives for purchasing are difficult. But if they had an alternative around milk powder, for instance, they might seek that from someone else just to make a point, if nothing else, for a while.
I'm really really glad you brought up trade, because that's something we're getting into a bit more later on. Just one more question dealing with the U.S. New Zealand relations under a second Trump administration. First, I'm keen to get your opinion on this. There's been a lot of talk recently with Trump about allies having to spend more on their defense budget, and in New Zealand, there's been a bit of discussion about that as well. Because New Zealand for the past 2 decades has spent less than 1% of GDP on defense. Do you think President Trump could go that far to suggest to countries like New Zealand to be spending more on their defense budgets?
Oh, I think without doubt he absolutely will. I mean, I think he'll say, look, I'm sick of paying the world's bill for security and you all have to do more. And that's not just Europe. I think that will include New Zealand. Interesting enough, the Prime Minister has been saying to me that he thought the way the numbers were calculated, our spending was a bit higher. But they are talking in New Zealand at the moment of an agreed spend of about 2% of GDP. So it does depend a little bit on where your starting point is. But what we do know is the commitment to spend more on defence will go up. The question I always think with that spending, I mean, it's one thing to say, look, spend 2% and you meet the rules and everything's good. The question is, what do you get for that? In other words, what's useful? So in my time when I was PM, and things might change, but when I was around, the Canadians, the Americans, the Australians, the Brits, they desperately wanted our SAS. They saw them as an elite force capable of doing incredible things and really world class. I think we'd offered to send them a couple of clapped out old tanks or a couple of boats that, were sort of like Apple iPhone 1.0. I honestly think they would laugh at us and say, thanks very much, you might as well just keep them at home. So I think in building up expenditure, I think we have to say, well, what are we trying to get from that? And the answer is probably better surveillance of maritime assets and making sure that the Asia Pacific is protected from a fisheries rights perspective and other matters there. I think there's some other things we can do, making sure we have a better capability again for natural disasters and things. So less actually about war and more about how you can use it. One thing that does flow from all that, though, I think when the dust settles, the American administration will eventually say, what we really want you to do is spend more money and more time, and we have been doing this, but increasingly more time and money looking after the Pacific. And it'll have the same message for Australia, because the main argument will be, you're a long way away from other stuff, we understand that, but we can't cover all bases. So every day we have to worry about Fiji or Tonga or Samoa or the Cook Islands is a day we can't be spending as much time worrying about what's happening in Gaza or Ukraine. So that's where the pressure will come.
And it was really good you mentioned about the different aspects of the relationship, not just the military, but the fact that it's a very multifaceted thing, even though in the media we look purely at the military. So it's a really, really good way of seeing it. Professor Bill, what are your thoughts? How far do you think Trump will go in regards to pushing allies? Because we saw with the Munich speech with President J.D. Vance and the push for the traditional allies, some of the more closer, more powerful countries. But how far would you think President Trump would go in even pursuing other countries to increase their budget spending?
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons I say that the U.S. is becoming a less reliable partner in some ways on security than it had been. It's not just that Trump is pushing allies to increase security spending or defense spending. It's also that the U.S. is less consistently clear in its commitments now on some basic defense agreements and frameworks that have been there for generations. So it's hard to say how far he will or will not go with this. I didn't mean to suggest earlier, by the way, that the U.S. would be less reliable as a security partner than China, simply less reliable than it had been in the relatively recent past. And so I think Trump will push this pretty much as far as he can. He's already pushing it extraordinarily far in the case of Europe. A lot of people within Europe are very upset about the threshold to which NATO allies are meant to raise their defense budgets going up. It had been 2%, then 3%. Now he's talking about 5, 6%. The U.S. doesn't even spend that kind of budget. I think only Poland within the NATO alliance is spending close to 5 or 6% of its GDP on defense. In terms of looking at the Pacific as a whole, though, and having Australia and New Zealand play stronger roles in the Pacific, I actually do think that is very much in the U.S. interest, and also probably, I hope, at the center of what the U.S. is really driving at and its strategic policy. Because what has been happening quite clearly over the past decade, I would say, is that the U.S. has allowed important relationships with Pacific Island states to atrophy, or at least to be neglected to an alarming degree. And as that has occurred, China has not been shy about stepping into the breach to fill those gaps. The other thing that's been happening in certain parts of the Pacific for even a longer time than that is this kind of checkbook diplomacy between mainland China and Taiwan. And it had been that many states in the Pacific had recognized the ROC government in Taiwan and not given recognition to the government in Beijing. That has shifted rather decisively over about the last 10 to 15 years to the disadvantage of Taiwan and to the advantage of Chinese government. That, of course, also has brought some of those countries much closer to China politically as well as economically. So yes, to the extent that there is an appetite and a willingness on the part of New Zealand or Australia to supply some of the good relations that are necessary, both economically and politically, across the Pacific, to make sure that those Pacific Island states do not move closer to China in particularly security terms, but also ideally economic terms. I think that would be all to the good. I just hope that Trump and his administration are thinking that strategically and that broad-mindedly. On this larger issue that keeps coming up, I'll just say very quickly, I think the key from the perspective of the US or others outside the region, really, is not to force smaller states to make the choice between all in or all out with either China or the US. Because as I was trying to say earlier, I think it's impossible to say to New Zealand, much less smaller states in the Pacific, you can't trade with China anymore. You have to make a choice. You have to either leave China relationship economically completely or to a very large degree, or you have to no longer be with us on security terms. There has to be a way to present a less unpalatable choice or less of a stark choice, such that it allows countries to continue to have flourishing trade with China, but also to have a reliable, stable, and enduring security relationship with the United States and with the West more generally.
Really interesting points, man. You mentioned about Australia and the Pacific Islands, and this question I'm keen to get both your opinions on. So John, I'll start with you, then I'll Professor Bill, if you can comment as well. Is that there's been some commentary about Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Some analysts have said that because of the reduced climate funding to Pacific nations, we've seen countries like the Cook Islands turn to China. Do you agree with this analysis, and do you see this trend accelerating with US aid being limited, with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement? Do you see China taking more advantage, to use for want of a better term, in forming relationships with some of the Pacific Islands?
Yeah, I think it's exactly as Bill said earlier. I said if the United States, withdraws out of a particular area or perspective and leaves a void, someone's going to have to fill that void. And China is really willing and able, usually, because it's taking a very, in Chinese terms, long-term perspective on how it builds and cements relationships for all sorts of different reasons. And there's no question that in the Pacific, the vulnerability that they feel about climate change and rising sea levels and temperatures is acutely not only felt, but a very significant issue for them. So I do think that makes them more receptive to messages and support from Beijing. And I think to a certain degree, that's exactly what you saw from the Cook Islands. I think there's a bit of naivety, I think, sometimes from the Pacific Islands, that they think that they can kind of have their cake and eat it. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I think, the more they get, publicly closer to China, the more that will put pressure both on Australia and New Zealand as significant funders through the Pacific Island Forum, but also actually even the United States. And you can see how much the Americans are thinking about this issue pre-Donald Trump, because I think it was last year, President Biden actually hosted all of the leaders of the Pacific in a summit in Washington. I mean, it was quite an extraordinary move, I thought. So yeah, there's a real vulnerability there. And again, I 100% agree with Bill. Having gone through the Pacific a lot over the years, it's very, very clear that if we went back a while ago, it was much more evenly divided who their allegiances were, whether it was Taiwan or mainland China. Now it's moving very much towards China. And what appears to be the case is that there's a mercantile aspect of that. It's access to fisheries or maybe some other resources. But I do think it's not implausible that there's a military aspect of that as well. Could they park up military assets? Have a naval capability that's welcomed there? I think that is real.
Mr. Bill?
Yeah, I basically agree. I mean, I think the issue on the Paris Agreement and climate change is an interesting one. I'm not sure it overlaps completely with the kind of strategic aspect of things that we're mostly focusing on in this discussion. So I think, the U.S. not participating in the Paris Agreement is unfortunate. It doesn't help to make it more enforceable or more attractive to the rest of the world. And I think it does leave open areas in which things can be easily pursued that wouldn't necessarily be as easy to pursue if that agreement were really more widely accepted, particularly by the United States. But I also think that more broadly, there is definitely an issue of sort of strategic balance within the Pacific shifting, not just from Taiwan towards the mainland of China, but also more generally away from the United States. For 50 years, roughly 60 years, let's say, from the time of the Spanish-American War until the end of the Second World War, the U.S. spent a great deal of time and effort trying to secure a position of relative dominance all the way across the Pacific. And it has maintained that position to a high degree ever since. Now, that's a tremendous advantage if you look in strategic terms against China. China is frustrated by not being able to sort of really break out from the so-called first island chain. Well, if that should happen, then look beyond that, all the way across the Pacific, there are a number of small states, and then eventually you get to places like Guam and Hawaii that are actually U.S. controlled. If those Pacific Island states begin to shift, and actually China has access to those waters, but also just in terms of influence, some sway over those large areas of territory, because those states are small, but their territories are quite large. That then means a sort of general sort of geostrategic shift of basic access to the Pacific changing from the advantage of the U.S. to the advantage of China. I think that is a really significant move. I actually would also then say that in the U.S., the general sentiment has been one of being asleep at the switch until very recently, and to still, I think, an alarming degree. The fact that there was a U.S. hosted summit of all the Pacific Island leaders shouldn't be extraordinary. I think that should be happening quite frequently if the U.S. is actually committed to retaining its position in this part of the world. And to the extent that it's not feasible or desirable to do so in a really active, consistent way, leaning on Australia and New Zealand to do more in the Pacific is not a bad strategy. And I hope that that is the strategy sort of beneath the surface, because in terms of public statements coming out from the current administration, it isn't obvious that they're even doing that.
Just on the note of China, so John, I'll ask you one more question because I know this is something we've spoken on recently at the Vision 2025 event, where you emphasize maintaining strong ties with China. Just in simple terms, how do you think the relationship should be managed going forward, and what would your ideal vision be?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're a little country. We're basically, as I always used to say, we're the last bus stop on the planet. We're home to 5 million people. We're at the bottom of the world and no one knows us a living. And we learned when Britain went into the European Common Market in the 70s that an over-reliance on one market causes extraordinary vulnerabilities to a country like New Zealand. So I think we need to have the best relations we can with everyone, and that's worked to our advantage. We won in my time our seat on the UN Security Council in a contested bid, which was difficult, against Turkey and Spain, and they had natural alliances which were much greater than the ones that we had, but we managed to get there. And I think that shows you that New Zealand generally has been held in wide regard. So I think it's not new that some of our traditional friends have always thought we were a little too close to China. But as I've always tried to explain to people, look, we just have different relationships with different people. And in China's case, they've been home to well over 1 billion people, a growing middle class, and they've wanted to buy the food-based products that New Zealand's largely produce. And it hasn't been any more complicated than that. I think our relationship with someone like the United States is far deeper, far more traditional, far more based on everything from trade to security to cultural exchange, if you like. So I don't think we should try and confuse those things. We're not trying to replicate our US relationship with China. But I do think that I probably sit in a small group, and arguably probably wrong, but I don't see China as the aggressor that many people say they are. I'm not ruling out that one day they couldn't, try and have a large position back in Taiwan. I think they'll never surrender the one China policy in their view of territorial authority over Taiwan and Hong Kong and the likes. But outside of that, I don't think history is a great indicator that they're actually looking to be militarily aggressive. And so a lot of what people worry about are things which are useful to create a political fear. I mean, if you look in the United States, from what I can see, there's absolutely nothing the Democrats and the Republicans can agree on other than China is bad. That is about the only thing they can agree on. So they've created in the public's mind, a very strong view that, for so many reasons, China doesn't play fair and is a threat. I'm just not sure I really kind of see that threat. So, I mean, from my point of view, I just got to look at it and go, well, if we could manage to walk and chew gum at the same time, and we could have a good, solid, trustworthy relationship with the United States, while at the same time having a good trading relationship and be, a pretty decent friend actually to China, I think the world benefits from that, because as you find in life, I mean, you don't really achieve much when you're yelling and screaming at one another. Realistically, the better outcomes come where you can have a civil conversation and explain differences. Now, that might all sound quaint and cute and nice and not really work. I think Donald Trump might say, look, that's all lovely, but that doesn't work. It's only fear and force that works. But it's not strictly true. So I think, in a world where you're trying to de-escalate issues, having people that can actually present another perspective in an unthreatening way, I don't think is a bad thing.
Thank you for those comments. I will now go into the pre-submitted questions. Our first question is, and this is for both of you, could Trump's warm relationship with Putin and the lack of consequences for Russia's territorial ambitions in Ukraine embolden Russia in its dispute with Japan over the Kuril Islands? What are the implications for New Zealand's security given its strong ties with Japan? So John, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? All the things that are happening with Putin and Russia, and I mean, look, it's hard to know. I think my own view of it is that Donald Trump is trying to represent that he can do a few things. One, he can actually do deals. So his point is, I'm a deal doer. We've sat around for years, and President Biden didn't achieve much, and it just cost a lot. And I think he has an ambition of getting the Nobel Peace Prize. I really do. I think he's trying to say, I'm going to be it's going to be a different way of doing it, but my model is to go out there and show the world that, I'm going to deliver peace in Ukraine. I'm going to deliver peace in Gaza and whatever. Now, you might say, and rightfully people might say, my goodness, that's sort of what cost, and how does that look for the Ukrainian people or the Palestinians, but he would say, well, okay, it's still better than people dying and the cost of all that. Does that mean that Putin is emboldened to do a lot more things? Again, maybe, but again, this is probably a bit of a naive perspective, but I kind of look at it and say, like, what are people's motivations? In China, it's very much, we believe a one China, that's it. Don't challenge us on that. It's Taiwan and Hong Kong. It's everybody. We're all Mother China. In Russia, I think it's very much put the band back together again. I don't think it's interested necessarily a whole lot of it. I mean, it's not as strictly clear cut as that, but I do think that, I mean, I'm not saying for 1 second I'd agree with this, but his whole argument would be Ukrainians largely see themselves as Russians, and all I'm doing is restoring their authority and mana, as we would say in New Zealand, to be Russians. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that's the way he would present. That's what the Russian public would believe. So does that mean that he therefore goes off and does other things in the Pacific? I'm not so sure.
Mr. Bill?
Yeah, I think one aspect of this at a broader level is that I also don't think that China is inherently aggressive or really a revisionist power in the way that a lot of people who talk in those terms like to characterize it. But what I do think is that there's a fundamental difference of worldviews between, let's say, the US and China. I think that in China, there's a general consensus that the world is headed towards a kind of multipolar balance of power, and that an era in which any given state is capable of unipolar hegemony is probably over. So the US enjoyed a kind of unipolar hegemony after the Cold War, but that's long done. And I think the other thing that China doesn't want, but the US is maybe a little more comfortable with than a multipolar world, is a bipolar competition. And so I think where this speaks to Russia is that the challenge remains how to steer the world towards a kind of multipolar balance of power that is sufficiently stable to assure, for example, the United States, that it's not going to be at high risk of accidental conflict or war, but also that does not carve the world up into spheres of influence. And this is where I think the real challenge is with Russia. Those who advocate for a change of policy similar to what Trump has done have often couched that argument in those sorts of terms of sphere of influence, that a great power is entitled to a certain sphere of influence. And in Russia's case, that includes Ukraine. And the West's treading upon that sphere is what provoked the war, at least indirectly. If one buys that argument, then it would follow that the Kuril Islands and other areas around the Bering Sea and the Northwestern Pacific might well be also part of what Russia would need to consider as its sphere of influence, and that we could see a legitimate extension of that there. Similarly, if we then say China is also entitled to a legitimate sphere of influence, that would presumably include at least Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, but quite possibly also Korean Peninsula or the whole of the South China Sea. I don't think that's really in the US national interest or necessarily in the interest of anyone that would like to see a world order similar to what we've seen over the last 50, 60 years be preserved at all. And so the challenge, therefore, will be to steer towards a multipolar balance of power world that isn't rigidly carved into spheres of influence. Now, how do we get there and what would such a world look like? I don't have an easy answer, but I think it's absolutely essential that we not give in to sphere of influence type thinking, because that would play directly into the kind of logic under which Russian aggression against the Kuril Islands would be what would follow soon after that, or what could well follow soon after that.
You mentioned about competition, and that takes us very well, a very good segue into our next submitted in question. This person asks, and so John, I'll start off with you again. What role do you see regional organizations like ASEAN in shaping a stable Indo-Pacific order amid renewed US-China competition?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you get a group of people together talking, there's some benefit that comes from that. It's a little bit like the United Nations. I'm not exactly that enthusiastic about the results they achieve. I think that if you really look at it, often there's a lot of talking, and even when you look at the Security Council, does it really deliver at the times you absolutely need it? And more often than not, no. But if you didn't, in the absence of having one, would you create it? The answer is yes. So I think there's a lot of like-minded interests in the ASEAN region. I mean, we haven't talked at all about India, but India is obviously emerging. It's quite a different beast actually from China, I think, but not necessarily anywhere nearly as aligned to America as people might want to argue. So I think I still think there's a lot of, again, in economic development sense, huge growth going to happen in the ASEAN region over the next 10, 20 years. And, some countries like in Indonesia or stuff will be, significant players. Clearly, India and China will be as well. So I think there is a role for those organizations, and as we saw through APEC, for instance, they have delivered, trade gains, which just have deserted the world when we've been looking for, a multilateral, a solution, which we're just not getting in other forums.
Isabel?
Yeah, I think with ASEAN, the interesting aspect of it is that it's been able to accomplish as much as it has. If you look around that region, I mean, the countries that are members of ASEAN are similar really only in that they are geographically located close to one another, right? There's tremendous differences in terms of political systems, um, religion, economic per capita GDP, economic structure, whatever it is that you want to measure them by, right? There's very little that binds these countries together in terms of common interest or common norms, really. But ASEAN has made tremendous strides at promoting things like freedom of movement for people, free flows of capital and goods, large trade agreements as a bloc, very notably with China, right? China's number one trading partner by a good margin and increasing is, in fact, ASEAN, bigger now than the European Union. So ASEAN has done a lot, but I think we're reaching the kind of frontier of what ASEAN is likely capable of. I do not think, given all those differences that I just talked about, that ASEAN can play a really meaningful role on security. Too many ASEAN states are just, or ASEAN member states are just not capable or interested in playing a security role in the region. And many of them have conflicting security interests. Some of them are even in security disputes or conflicts with one another. So I really think we're at the limit in terms of what ASEAN can do when it comes to diplomacy generally, but pretty much anything other than trade, and even probably on the trade front. So I wouldn't look there for a great deal of progress. But I would also endorse the position that we shouldn't, wish that ASEAN went away or say that it's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, and it has actually done quite a bit relative to what on paper it would look like it should be able to do.
Just as you mentioned, moving away from the security and going towards the economic. And so, John, I'm keen to get your thoughts because this goes very well into our next question. I know you mentioned on the same interview you did on one of the radio channels about talking why Trump might not be the best interest in New Zealand. You've spoken about the tariffs and the impact that will have on the primary sector. The next question I ask is that how do you feel New Zealand has done so far in diversifying its trade through emerging markets or regional frameworks like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, given the unpredictability of tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's done pretty well. Just to take a step back on trade, I mean, one of the great tragedies was when President Trump became the president in his first term. The first thing he did really was rip up TPP, which I'd spent a lot of time on with President Obama and obviously clearly many other leaders, because it did give New Zealand an opportunity to have a free trade agreement with the United States, which we don't have. And I often say it to our American friends, if you want to make our life a little bit easier, here's a pretty simple way of doing that. But practically, are they going to sign a bilateral free trade agreement with New Zealand? I'm not confident. But yeah, as I said earlier, New Zealand has diversified very, very significantly. And I think there's more to come. I mean, we've been in the process of the current government's just signed a free trade agreement, which started again under my time with the Gulf states and out in the Middle East. I think India, the Prime Minister I know, is keen to go and again push that along as much as it's possible. It's not just China that's our big trading relationship in the region. If you take Australia out as well, there's many other countries which have similar characteristics. As Bill said, they're different, but they have similar characteristics in demand. So there is lots of opportunity out there for us. I mean, we live in a world where we believe in high quality, comprehensive free trade agreements. We benefit when the world is playing under those rules. And in a world where tariffs are applied, we lose. And you saw that the other day where Ted Cruz came out on some fake news about the way Israelis were being treated in New Zealand. He wanted to apply tariffs. Donald Trump seems to have said that if you have a sales tax like a GST, is that a tariff? well, okay, no, in my opinion. I mean, any more than if New Zealand business sells a product into California, they also pay a sales tax. So there's definitional issues here, but yeah, we clearly we produce a hell of a lot of a particular foods, and we can't and don't want to consume them all. So we need free trading lanes to make our economy flow, and in return for that, we buy enormous. We haven't produced a car in New Zealand for probably 30 years. I mean, we buy a lot of things from the world as well.
I just want to follow up on that because this is actually tied into one of the questions I initially wanted to ask. You were Prime Minister just as President Obama came in. So I'm keen to know what was the global context like, because at the time they're coming out of Bush #2, and there was a lot of criticism of America about the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, and I know Professor Bill has spoken about how he has said that there's a misconception that America was pulling up from the world under President Trump. And in fact, Professor Bill, if I'm correct, you said it was under Obama they started gradually pulling out, given the impacts of the Gulf War, Afghanistan War. Just dealing with President Obama at the time in '09, what was it like? Just the context.
Yeah, look, my sense was, I mean, everyone says, the president wanted to negotiate TPP because it was all about containment of China. I'm not sure that I'd agree with that. I can't ever recall him using those kinds of words. What is true is that I think defense and state got convinced in the US of the argument that unless America had a higher presence in the Asia region, that presence would be filled by a more assertive China. And so it's less about containment and more about saying, well, we really need to be seen as reliable friends in the region. And I think that point that Bill's been making, that does America start looking like a far less reliable partner? That's the real risk here. I mean, as I say, we had an FTA with America under the TPP, and the very first thing that happened under Donald Trump was it got ripped up. So do they feel less reliable on trade from the seat I sit in? The answer is yes. And I think you just can't get away from the fact that what's the core of what's driving Donald Trump's support base is a sense of globalization hasn't worked and we've been treated unfairly. And we're competing with people who play by very different rules. We have one arm tied behind our back, and you can never win a fair fight like that. And someone needs to stand up for us. And I don't think Donald Trump's ever been a great fan of trade anyway. So you're pushing on a very open door. So I'm anticipating in the next 3 or 4 years, you will see more and more restrictions on trade. Yeah, I'm not saying every country is going to have massive tariffs put on them, but I think as a general rule, if the time that I was in office, and let's call it that period from 2000 to 2015, was sort of dominated by a general sense that the world was going to be highly reliant on international trade flows and globalization and specialization, then I think we're now entering an era where we're pulling, because of Donald Trump's view, the world is pulling back on that. And maybe COVID in part and the reliance on unreliable supply chains was part of that thinking as well. It's probably not fair to say it's all just Donald Trump, but there's definitely been a marked change in my view.
We'll put 2 more questions. So, Professor Bill, I'll start off with you. Given your research on political structures and policy making in China, how might the Chinese leadership adapt its foreign policy strategy in response to Trump's return?
Well, a couple things. First, just on this issue of sort of the end of globalization that you're just talking about, I think in part it is Trump and driven by Trump, but part of it's also driven by the rise of political coalitions in a number of countries that are much more skeptical of globalization as an agenda for growth, not least in China. Actually, Xi Jinping's governing coalition is far more skeptical of globalization than was particularly Jiang Zemin's, but even the early years of Hu Jintao. And if we look at the dual circulation strategy, the internal circulation is the core one. It's external circulation that serves the needs of internal circulation. And so I think there's a lot of skepticism around free trade. And I think that we can see this underscored by some of the behavior coming out from, for example, the US. So if we look at the first Trump term, yes, he destroyed TPP, but then very interestingly, I thought he had a golden opportunity just a few weeks or maybe a month or so into his term when he hosted Abe Shinzo in Mar-a-Lago and declined even to discuss the possibility of a bilateral free trade deal. And I do think it would absolutely be pretty obviously in the US interest to have a free trade agreement with Japan, with New Zealand, with a number of other countries. I mean, yes, certain fairly niche sectors in the US might object, but the overall US economy would clearly benefit from this, and it would greatly improve the US political position vis-a-vis a number of key allies. So it's odd. It's odd behavior, and it is troubling. If we think in terms of what is China going to do about Trump, I think there's actually a strategy that has more or less crystallized from what I can tell. It's never been sort of broadcast as a strategy. I don't have a document to point to say this is the policy, but I think there's kind of a 4-point plan as best as I can discern inside Chinese policy circles and academic circles about how best to handle Trump. And the first point is ignore him as much as possible, right? That if he's going to make a lot of noise, he's going to cause a lot of trouble, he's going to try to provoke a reaction in many ways, but the best response usually is simply to ignore him. Paying attention will only escalate things or make things worse. So ignore him as much as possible, or respond only symbolically or in kind of a vague gesture. The second point is try to spin losses into wins. So if Trump increases tariffs on China, that will hurt some aspects of the Chinese economy. It's not good for China in general. It's a loss. How can you spin it into a win? Well, you can spin it into a win by using it to improve China's political position, internally as well as externally, to show that, look, now China is actually the victim. The U.S. has gone crazy. China is actually the more reliable trade partner. The U.S., look how unreliable they are, right? That can be a benefit from this. It also just improves China's overall position in the global economy. If the U.S. weakens its overall sort of strong position in international trade, that gap will be filled by somebody, in this case, partially, at least by China. China will be more important, stronger in international forums, within international institutions, as the US becomes weaker and more isolationist. So the loss can be spun into something of a win. The third point in the strategy is exactly to fill gaps whenever possible. So we're talking about Pacific Islands, we're talking about other parts of the world where the US is leaving open gaps. Gaps of leadership, gaps of security guarantees, gaps in trade, wherever that might be, to the extent that China has the resources and the capacity and the desire to fill the gap. It's a good idea to fill it. That would be the third point of the strategy. The fourth is generally to try to promote a narrative of China as a responsible stakeholder, as a reliable guarantor of global free trade networks and institutions, and of the world system as a whole, at the hub of international networks and institutions, rather than on the outs, right? At the table to help shape and enforce the rules in an equitable way, rather than on the outside looking in or trying to undermine the system, as China perhaps has done in past iterations. And as the US abdicates that leadership role, it's easier and easier to portray that narrative and to try to play that role for China. So basically, from China's point of view, time is probably on their side vis-a-vis Trump specifically, not necessarily over the other aspects of the relationships involved, but or other dimensions of Chinese politics. But in terms of Trump specifically, it's quite likely that the Chinese government will outlast the Trump administration. And if they can wait it out and play the strategy of 4 basic points, I think the odds of success are reasonably high, depending on how you measure that, in that it's unlikely that the U.S. position will improve if they continue to behave as Trump so far has indicated that he's likely to, and if China manages to stick to its strategy reasonably well.
Thank you. It's very helpful and detailed policy brief. I'm sure many listeners and students would find that quite helpful. Final question we have submitted in, and it's for Sir John, is New Zealand recently released a foreign policy reset document which signals a shift from its traditionally independent stance. What do you believe are the long-term consequences of this alignment, or realignment rather?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of legitimate questions being asked in New Zealand about what the right posturing and position is. I'm not sure it is as clear-cut as the way that's described. I think New Zealand will always want to retain an independent foreign policy where it makes its own decisions based on the facts presented before it. It's not a carte blanche, check that they're signing up to. But I think, like everyone, we're having to consider what the changing rules of the game are, I feel like, and what that might all mean. I mean, New Zealand benefits, I think, enormously from having those pretty close, strategic relationships with our traditional partners, with our Five Eyes partners. It's not just from an intelligence point of view, but it's also from even from a comfort perspective. I mean, as I said earlier, I believe New Zealand has syndicated its defence, and in doing so can spend less but still achieve a very, very good outcome. But what that doesn't mean is New Zealand can't play its part in any form. You can't say, I want to rely on our, Five Eyes partners if things go wrong, but I'm never there to support them when they're carrying out causes that are necessary. And that was the rationale behind things like sending people to Iraq and Afghanistan. It was partly we wanted to stand up for the people that were having atrocities done to them. But equally, you can't just always be the neighbour that goes over for the party next door and never takes a drink and never takes some food. So you've got to be part of that. So yeah, I wouldn't have it in too dramatic terms. I think the government's definitely looking at it. I don't know exactly where it ends up on things like AUKUS Pillar 2, but I do think there's a bit of a sense that there's the cleaner version of an independent foreign policy. Maybe that's at least being tested at the moment.
On that note, we've covered some really good ground in this discussion. We've gone over the impact of the U.S. China relationship and how that had an impact on New Zealand's foreign policy decision making. Huge thank you to both our panel members, Sir John Key and Professor William Hurst. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you, everyone, for being part of this discussion and submitting in your questions. Please keep the conversation going. Please feel free to tag the Center for Geopolitics, share within your networks, and we look forward to having you at some of our future panels.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.